Hello, thank you for coming to watch my presentation. My name is Samara Patterson. I'm a research assistant at the NTID Center on Culture and Language. Today we will be discussing documenting individual variation in ASL. We will discuss some of our early findings about sociolinguistic variation and language change in ASL. First, I want to acknowledge our current DIVA team, who have been working on this project for 2 years. I'm going to begin with a quick briefing about sociolinguistic variation studies in ASL. The study of variation in ASL is as old as research on the ASL language. Cronenberg was the first to document ASL variation among deaf communities in 1965. He worked with Stokey and Kasserline to publish the first dictionary of ASL. On the slide, we have a few examples of old print variants for the sign birthday from the book Signs Across America. So we're aware that there has been a long history of recognizing variation in ASL. So we've recognized that variational ASL research has been successful, but the largest regional variation study only includes 207 signers from 7 cities. The participants in this research study have diverse backgrounds, and the study only lasted about 6 or 7 years. But for a long time, there's been a big resource problem in the field, with time, money, equipment, and personnel. Before, it was very labor-intensive and expensive to collect this data, and research focused on very small areas, leaving out the vast majority of signers. We need to think about who has traditionally been involved with these studies, where these studies have been conducted, who has been systematically left out, and how we can fix these issues. Filming at RIT and NTID has pretty much solved most of these problems. We've taken advantage of the Deaf Hub. The time that we conduct these studies is faster, our technology is better, and we don't need to invest as much money in this research. In considering these problems, we've developed this project called Documenting Individual Variation in ASL, or DIVA for short. We've conducted a pilot study at NTID to collect our preliminary data for our project deployment. We started our research in 2018, collecting data from deaf, hard of hearing, and CODA students who learned ASL before middle school age. We used 2 tasks, first a lexical elicitation task, and then a sociolinguistic interview, to collect data on signs we were interested in and about experiences using ASL. We had 110 lexical items and 3 interview questions we collected over many hours of data. RIT and NTID is home to more than 1,200 deaf, hard of hearing students and CODAs whose parents sign. It makes it the perfect place to document variation as students come to RIT with signing varieties and a mix of backgrounds. Our basic workflow for the project proceeded like this. We would recruit participants in NTID Common Spaces or Facebook. We began with our lexical elicitation experiment, which was filmed and uploaded. We would begin editing videos and analyzing different variations we saw. And participants who participated in the first study were asked to return again for the second portion of the sociolinguistic interviews. And lastly, we compare the documented variations and collaborate with any pre-existing data banks that exist. We try to see if we can find any differences or trends in the data. So it's obvious we have so much data, but today we'll be giving a brief snapshot of the overall data we've collected, and then we'll focus on 5 individual signs which we have proved to be interesting in our preliminary analyses. It's important to note that all of the examples you'll see today are from participants who gave consent to share their data. Here you can see the number of participants by region of the states that we have collected data from. Because RIT is on the East Coast, most of our students are from the Northeast and the Midwest, but we do have some from the West and Southern areas as well. Over only 1 year of data collection, we've already collected data from about half of the 50 states, being 24, and students that have participated come from diverse backgrounds. So today we will focus on 5 signs in particular. Each one was selected to illustrate an interesting observation about variation in ASL. We will discuss each sign and put the data in context of language change and variation, based on region, race, gender, and such. We've also separated each word and their variations based on lexical or phonological. You can see some areas here interesting. Some have more phonological variations, such as intersectionality has 13 phonological variants and only 1 lexical, while words like birthday we found to have completely different variants lexically instead of phonologically. So our first sign is birthday, which we found to have 8 variants from 24 states with 38 participants. The most common variant we found was this. Most of the variants we found were based on geographical location instead of race or gender. And here we have 7 different examples of variants that we found from different states for birthday. The first from New York, the second from California, the third from Pennsylvania, fourth from Michigan, fifth from Alabama, sixth from New Jersey, and lastly from Kansas. So we see here that in our study, we found only 8 variants from about half of the country in 24 states. And you remember I mentioned before in the book Signs Across America, that study found 22 variants. So in our data collection, we've noticed this idea of shrinking variation, and signers are converging more to a dominant single variant. It's also important to mention that a lot of the participants that we collected data from had mentioned how growing up at home they used a different sign, but now they focus more on this dominant variant with the middle fingertip that taps on the chin and then the chest. Our second sign is underwear. We collected 13 lexical variants from 24 states across 38 people. Our most common 2 variants are and again, similarly to birthday, the variants we found in underwear were based from where the participants came from, based on geography. So here we have 4 more examples of state and region variations. The first from Minnesota, the second from Michigan, the third from Alabama, and the last from New Jersey. So it's interesting comparing birthday to underwear, as they both had the same number of participants, being 38, and the same number of states, being 24. But birthday, we identified only 8 variants, and in underwear, we identified 13. That's about 2 times more. A possibility for this could be because underwear is not in people's everyday discourse. It's kind of a taboo subject. Not many people converse about this, so many people decide to keep the sign they use from going up. But birthday is typically in our everyday discourse, and if you see someone using a more common variant, you're more likely to adopt it yourself. So we see that underwear has maintained variation, and people's regional signs are still strongly represented. So now we'll change our focus to words related to the topics of social justice. The next three words we will discuss, we added to our data collection later on, so there are only 23 participants. So for the sign social justice, we identified 12 variants from 13 states in 23 people. The 2 most common variants are It's important to notice that while in birthday and underwear, geography was what predicted variance the most, in this situation, we focus more on variance based on the participant's race. People who used the variant SJ were 80% white and only 20% people of color. An important point to mention based on this data collection, wondering why more white signers use the more dominant variant, is that there was one social justice class offered at NTID, and many of the students that ended up enrolling in that class were white students. The teacher used this sign variant, SJ, to teach the class, and those students might have been more likely to adopt this variant. It's important for us to consider variants based on gender, race, and geography, but also the idea of these social networks, how people interact, and how word spread this way as well. and how people understand a concept impacts how they create meaning in a sign. If you think about social justice in an equalizing way and equity, you might be more likely to sign it this way. Or, if you compare social to socio, signing it this way, you might be inclined to sign it this second way. Or maybe you think justice, meaning courts and the court system and judges, you might be more inclined to sign it the third way. It truly depends on your understanding of the word. Our next sign focused on was racism, and we chose this because in today's political climate, racism is a word we see used more and more in conversations. The most 3 common variants we found were and similarly to social justice, these variants were based on people's races, and there was a difference between white people and people of color. We did identify one new variation related to race as well, and a white person from Alabama had signed racism this way. And lastly, intersectionality. We had identified 14 variants from 13 states, and the 2 most common variants we see are Now we noticed that 13 out of the 14 variants we identified were phonological, meaning there were 1 or 2 different parameters that might have been different between the signs, but most of the rest of the parameters were similar. It might have been difference in slight movement, and we identified these as phonological variants. The word intersectionality is important for us to recognize that it was coined in 1989 by a Black woman named Kimberly Crenshaw. And the sign for intersectionality was originated in use from Dr. Carla Garcia Fernandez in 2010, meaning that the sign for this word is only 10 years old and used in very specific social networks. But as more and more people discuss this topic in context of discussing systematic oppression, there may be more standardization. It's important for us to remember that variation in ASL is still rampant, and although some signs may be converging on a dominant variant, other signs may be maintaining their regional variants. Different social networks and conceptualization of meanings are important for understanding variation, such as in racism and social justice. And new words popping up in our lexicon can support several competing variants with confusion. So different signs may be popping up in the near future. In the project's next steps, we'll begin encoding sociolinguistic interviews in the fall and winter of 2020. We'll begin our phonological coding using a program called SUSL. We will be analyzing more ideologies and beliefs about variation in ASL and deaf communities. And we'll be continuing to explore the role of social networks and communities of practice in variation, and hoping to create a web-based infrastructure to support our research goals. Thank you for watching.